Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. What happens if AI delivers major advances in capability and productivity, but also creates significant disruption to jobs, incomes, and public finances? That question sits at the heart of today's episode. Our guest is Adrian Brown, the founder and chief executive of Windfall Trust, a non-profit focused on helping governments and societies prepare for the economic consequences of advanced AI. Windfall describes itself not as a think tank, but as a policy accelerator for the age of artificial intelligence. Their work starts from a simple premise. If AI systems significantly reshape the economy, then the question is not only how we build them, but how we prepare for their impacts and how the gains are ultimately shared. Before founding Windfall Trust, Adrian was the founding executive director of the Centre for Public Impact, worked as a policy advisor in the UK Cabinet Office, and held roles at McKinsey and the Boston Consulting Group. Adrian, welcome to the London Futurists podcast.
Thanks very much, David. It's great to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Adrian.
Adrian, much of the public conversation about AI focuses on capabilities or safety. You've argued that the economic implications are still underexplored. What do you think most people are currently missing?
Yes, well, as you said in the question, David, we're not short of debate and discussion about AI at the moment. One of the issues with AI, of course, is as a general purpose technology, you can talk about almost any aspect of work or life or culture or technology that you want to, and AI will intersect with it. So there's a lot of discussion about the impact of AI broadly on our societies, the concerns we might want to have in relation to safety, how the capabilities are advancing, which is all merited and important that we discuss. It seems to me, though, that the point at which AI starts to interact with the economy and with people's jobs and with the jobs that they may hope their children are going to be doing in a few years' time is the point at which maybe some of the more abstract concerns that are potentially being debated amongst a rather small group of economists right now will hit home. And as we've known from previous disruptions to economies, you don't actually have to have that much of a shift in unemployment, for example, in headline rate of unemployment, for it to become a serious political issue with very, very great consequences. So we at Windfall Trust believe that these potential economic implications of advanced AI warrant much greater attention now before they hit than they are currently being given. And as perhaps we'll discuss a little later in the podcast, that doesn't require you to necessarily believe one particular version of the future. You can adopt an approach of thinking in scenarios, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't start thinking about the future, regardless of which particular version you think we're heading towards.
Is Windfall Trust specifically about full automation and the future of jobs? Or do you cover the technological singularity and other AI issues as well?
We are purely focused on the economic consequences of advanced AI. And the way I explain that to people is, of course, there are all of those other consequences. We're just focused on the economic consequences, which includes jobs, inequality, wealth distribution, etc., related to it. And we talk about advanced AI. Some people might say artificial general intelligence or the singularity, but the point there is to say there's quite a lot of debate now around whether we can see the impact of AI in the economy today, which is interesting to sift through the data and look at the numbers. But I think it's also important that we cast our mind forward a few years, 3, 4, 5 years into the future, 10 years into the future, and ask ourselves what might happen then and what the economic consequences of that could be, which might be wholly different and actually quite unrelated to the impact we're seeing in the economy right now.
Yes. David and I couldn't agree more. You're definitely singing to the choir in our case. And it's a strange situation that so few people are taking these issues seriously. You mentioned that there's a small number of economists debating it. Sadly, I think it is a small subset of the economics profession which is seriously debating this. They're starting to, but it's only very recently. The AI community, by which I mean most of San Francisco and quite a lot of Shanghai, Beijing, has been debating it vigorously for quite a while. And then meanwhile, The rest of the human race, 99.9% of people, are ignoring it entirely. And I think the reason for that is that, first of all, it sounds like science fiction. It sounds like something out of a science fiction movie. And secondly, the AI experts don't agree with each other. They vigorously disagree. There are some people who think that the whole thing is hype. Andrew Ng, one of the co-founders of Google Brain, famously said it's a bit like worrying about overcrowding on Mars. It's such a long way off. He was talking about superintelligence, but he could have been talking about full automation. And other people, including the people running big AI, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, think it's coming in a small number of years. So given that it sounds like science fiction and the experts don't agree, I think that kind of gives the rest of the population license to just ignore it. It's a bit scary. Nobody can agree. What's for tea? That's where I think we are, and we need to change that. And I'm delighted that you've set your organization up to help do that.
I absolutely agree with the diagnosis that you set out there. And I would say, yes, of course, most people have got busy lives and they're worried about all sorts of things, including what's for tea. That's absolutely to be expected. I think what is less acceptable is that people in positions of authority, the political class, policymakers broadly, leaders of not only the AI labs, who I do think have been raising the alarm about this for many years already, but broader corporate leaders, union leaders, etc., need to take this much more seriously. I think if you stop someone on the street and say, do you expect that someone somewhere in government is thinking about this? They will probably say yes. In fact, if you stop someone on the street and ask, what do you worry about in relation to AI? They say jobs. That's the thing they're worried about. So you would probably expect that the average person would think that the government is sort of thinking about this at minimum. What I'm arguing for from the position of Windfall Trust is that the extent to which this is being taken seriously in those corridors of power right now is so far behind what you would hope and expect, and probably most people on the street would expect, that it is an emergency. We do need to accelerate the thinking on this very, very rapidly.
So there are two problems. One is the lack of credible scenarios. And secondly, even when people see the scenarios, they still tend to file them away elsewhere. It's a bit like, was it Project Cygnus, which took place a number of years ago about UK's preparedness or lack of preparedness for a pandemic, but the actions that were agreed there were not in fact followed up. Let's break that down into two chunks. You are working with governments, I believe. You've had some exercises with some of their advisors at least. So what were the scenarios that you explained and walked through there, and how was the reaction?
Yes, so we have found scenarios to be very valuable for what you might call activating people to start to worry about this. And they're also a very useful tool for bringing together different groups of people. So we often have in the room, when we run these types of events, people from government, people from the labs themselves, the people who are building these technologies, economists, union leaders, the groups I was referencing earlier. When you provide a scenario, you give them a common framework to have a conversation between some very different starting points. So, for example, the people in the labs versus the economists. So scenarios are very useful for both orienting to the future and providing a scaffold for a meaningful and hopefully productive conversation. We started developing these scenarios last year. We started with a strong economic lens for reasons that are obvious, I suppose, and got a bunch of economists together in San Francisco, including people like Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize-winning economists, to spend a full day reflecting on 4 versions of the future. And those versions of the future were deliberately designed with collaboration from the people inside the Frontier Labs to be within the bounds of plausibility that the people building these technologies can accept. So these were not science fiction. These were stretched scenarios along different dimensions. Broadly, we were looking at things like, for example, the speed to which work is automated and the patterns of automation in the economy, the extent to which the fiscal position of the government is or is not undermined as that happens, the extent to which wealth starts to accumulate within one very small sector of society, for example, the AI labs, or is more diffuse. And by looking at different versions of these futures, we could then ask ourselves, what do we think would be happening in the rest of the economy? What do we think would be viable paths for policymakers to start to explore to remedy those situations? And the extent to which these futures might be ones we want to avoid, in fact, if we can't think that there is actually a very good route out of them. That was in September last year and included the leading economists in this space who were really thinking about AI, people like Eric Brynjolfsson at Stanford, Anton Koronek at the University of Virginia, although he's just about to join Anthropic now, and probably about 20 to 25 others. So that's the kind of group we're talking about. We've then used the knowledge from that session to develop further scenarios for other groups. So we try to bring bespoke scenarios to the group that we're dealing with. In the UK, in February, we had a similar kind of mix of people, but UK-oriented, and we had a scenario which was specifically about the UK. So we had one future for the UK set in 2030, I think it was, that tried to set out a sufficiently clear and alarming future so that people could really start to grapple with the consequences of it. It's not like we have stock scenarios we just wheel out. We do design them bespoke for different audiences.
Your most extreme scenario, how extreme is it? Do you envisage pretty much full automation, or do you envisage kind of 25% unemployment?
I should say we treat our scenarios as useful orientation for a conversation rather than saying we're predicting things necessarily. But we think it's important to have a range of scenarios. The most extreme versions of these scenarios, I think, are actually quite similar to your excellent economic singularity thinking. And your most recent essay in particular, I think, articulates this extremely clearly. So, yes, we include scenarios where we see rapid and broad-based automation of labor in the economy, not just cognitive tasks, but through to more manual tasks as well, as robotics potentially advances alongside the cognitive side. We certainly don't consider that to be off the table. And in fact, we think it's important to consider what some people may consider to be more extreme scenarios, because that's what forces some of the best thinking. And the thinking that you do in those more extreme scenarios will still apply often in many other scenarios as well.
Tell us more about the UK scenario for 2030. What was the key features of that?
The key features of that scenario were not as extreme as the economic singularity, but a progressive and relentless chipping away of particularly white-collar work, particularly entry-level white-collar work in the UK economy over the next few years. As that gets chipped away, the demand for government benefits starts to increase, of course, because people are out of work. And simultaneously, the fiscal position starts to deteriorate because labour is one of the main sources of tax income for countries like the United Kingdom. And so we start to see the tax take starting to become undermined as well. The position we placed policymakers in, and I think we set it in around 2030, was these trends are starting to be undeniable. We can no longer just dismiss the fact that we're starting to see quite significant erosion of white-collar work. We can't dismiss the fact that we're starting to see quite significant changes to the fiscal position and the fiscal outlook. What do you do? You're the Prime Minister, or you're advising the Prime Minister. What are you going to do at this juncture, which is the juncture before it's really got out of hand, before you've gone too far down the path? So we tried to pitch it at that moment where you can make interventions that could steer the ship.
Can you share any of the outcomes? What were the recommendations that people said to bolster the fiscal position of the government to avoid the thinning out of the welfare services?
We'll be right back after a quick break.
Imagine being in the boardroom with the world's most influential C-suite executives, exploring big questions about the economy, AI, and hybrid work. Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, hosted by Steve Odland, President and CEO of the Conference Board, the ultimate podcast for professionals seeking the truth beyond trending headlines. Cut through the noise and dive into data-driven discussions, unbiased, nonpartisan, and straight from the top. Listen to C-Suite Perspectives and harness the power of trusted insights for what's ahead.
One outcome, this is slightly different to the recommendations you're describing here, David, but one meta outcome from this was I think that many, if not all of the people in the room agreed that the UK government needs to accelerate its thinking on this. as Windfall, we generally argue, I think this is true in the UK elsewhere, that we need much broader thinking on the range of scenarios. So we can't just have this Goldilocks scenario of the future where AI helps boost some growth, some jobs are created, some jobs are destroyed, and we can find this golden path through. That's a very benign version of the future. We need to have a much wider range of scenarios. So I think people have left the room saying we need to start taking these scenarios seriously, not just have the sort of Goldilocks version in the middle. And we need a much wider range of debate on the policy side, because the policy debates tend to come, if you say, how are we going to respond to this? And you can play the sort of buzzword bingo if you interview a politician or another leader on this. It won't take very long for them to say the word reskilling, because reskilling tends to be the go-to option of like, well, jobs are changing, the requirements of the economy are changing, we need to reskill people. And reskilling has a place, of course, but reskilling is completely inadequate in the face of the type of challenge we're talking here. And that's before you get on to the point that reskilling really only works in a transitional disruption. If you've got a structural shift in the economy where the net demand for human labor is reduced, then reskilling, of course, is completely inappropriate. But even acknowledging that, reskilling is part of the policy landscape, but we need a much broader range of policy. So we need to be thinking about taxation. We need to be thinking about public services more broadly, the welfare system more broadly, and the social contract more broadly. So I think people left knowing or believing that they needed to be much more broad-based in their thinking than they had up until now. And this isn't just sort of a Goldilocks version of the future where if we do some good reskilling, we can probably find our way through.
Do you envisage when this automation happens, and I appreciate that you're dealing in scenarios and you're not forecasting, but do you envisage that the economy, the value in the economy will accrue to the developers and the deployers of AI, which means obviously the large language models and big AI, but also perhaps an ecosystem of software companies who facilitate large language models, although who knows, GPT-10 and Claude 20 may not need an ecosystem of other software. They may operate perfectly satisfactorily on their own. But do you envisage that the value add in the economy will shoot over to those organizations? Because if so, it's a bit hard to see what activity there is going on in the UK which could be taxed by a UK government.
This is one of the big debating points amongst economists. Even if you start to agree that you would see huge disruption along the lines of what you're describing, how will that value get shared between consumers, workers, corporates generally, and the AI labs in particular? We don't have a position on what is the most likely version of that, but we certainly do not dismiss the scenario that you're articulating, where it's possible that because of the flywheel effect of developing a very, very powerful AI model, some of these leading labs will accrue significant and potentially unreversible degree of power in the economy as wealth accrues to them, and they basically then line everything up around themselves. That's a possible scenario that should not be dismissed. If you get to that world, I think you do have a very hard problem of how you distribute wealth in an economy which has become so concentrated into just very few companies and very few people. Of course, there are some ideas around that. A lot of people would probably argue that if we are anticipating that, we should put in place policies to try and avoid that happening in the first place. This is the idea of pre-distribution, the idea of how can we distribute the wealth and gains from AI before they accrue rather than after. There's a lot of interesting literature on that as well.
On distribution, is there discussion of international aspects of that? Because it might be foreseen that a country like the USA could figure out how to distribute their wealth in its own country, but there's going to be many other countries that are going to be struggling. They won't have big AI companies. The UK isn't well positioned there particularly, but at least there is some vision of an AI economy. But many other countries are going to be left behind as never before. Is that part of the conversation?
Absolutely. A core part of our agenda as Windfall is not just to stimulate this policy discussion at the country level. And as you mentioned earlier, we are working with policymakers across a range of countries now, so the US, but others as well, including the UK, etc. But the policy conversation at that level must be supplemented by a conversation at the international level for exactly the reasons that you stated. I think it's not an unreasonable scenario to say that the US and maybe China are the ones that capture a lot of the upside here, and everybody else is in a different position trying to carve out their particular niche or just claim their particular piece of the pie. I'm not saying any of these conversations are easy, by the way, but that's why we need to get on with them. We do need to have serious conversations about what international taxation regimes look like currently and in the future, what international wealth redistribution schemes could look like. And that's a particular interest of windfalls, because the actual windfall in our name comes from broadly the concept of a windfall for humanity, that AI can generate this sort of huge upside and how can we share it. But then specifically this idea about the windfall clause, which is an idea from a few years ago of, could there be a promise that the AI labs could make today that if they achieved extraordinarily high levels of profitability in the future, they would pre-commit now to putting them into a global wealth redistribution mechanism rather than keeping them. Now, many people would consider that to be absolutely pie in the sky. But the problem it's trying to get at is a very real one and a very important one, which is we may find ourselves in a world where wealth is accruing to very, very particular places and everybody else is left behind. And how will we deal with that? Because a single country, even if you're the UK, I would say, is not necessarily going to have all of the tools at its disposal to actually remedy that alone.
How would the windfall clause be enforced? Companies may today, for good PR reasons, say, yeah, we're going to do this. But when the crunch comes and they have become extremely powerful, they can tell governments around the world to get lost.
Exactly. So I personally wouldn't rely on the windfall clause as a mechanism to save humanity from that particular future. That's why I believe we do need governments to start to take this much more seriously. Actually, a broader point, a lot of the running at the moment on this debate is being made by the AI labs. Just last week, OpenAI published what they called an industrial policy for the AI age, setting out some ideas for policy mechanisms that could help start to address some of the things we're talking about here, not the international one that was absent from their discussion. And it's great in one sense that the AI labs are contributing to this discussion, but the culture of Silicon Valley and the values of Silicon Valley are a very particular culture and set of values that are not really shared by many other people on this planet. And I think we need other voices to start shaping this conversation, not just leave it to Silicon Valley. Actually, the windfall clause idea is kind of a Silicon Valley idea. It's that the largesse of these wealthy companies in the future would very generously put money into this. Great if they're willing to do that, but we certainly shouldn't rely on it.
I think the problem might be the other way around from the way David expressed it. As you say, the windfall idea is a very Silicon Valley idea. They do tend to be kind of millenarian and think on a very large canvas and think about the future of humanity. In his most recent paper, Orman doesn't talk about this, but he has elsewhere talked about the fact that it's entirely possible that a large chunk of the economy will accrue to big AI and they will have to share it globally. One of the problems with that might actually be the American government. The American government may say, well, you might want to share your profits globally, but we don't want you to. We want America first. We want the money to stay here. And although people talk about big AI being too big to fail and having more power than governments, we've had recently a really powerful object lesson that when push comes to shove, presidents are more powerful than plutocrats. Elon Musk is a very determined individual, is the richest man in the world. And he had a showdown with President Trump and he lost. He lost badly and had to retreat. So when Sam Altman says, okay, we and Anthropic and Google DeepMind now own 40% of the world economy and everybody else is starving, we better do something about this. We're going to ship our profits overseas. You can quite imagine American presidents saying, well, you can give them 10%, but you can't give them any more than that. That could be a really major problem.
Absolutely. One response actually to the scenario you paint, which I think also has people worried, is if you do have these extremely powerful models in the future, then whilst it might be true today that presidents have more power than plutocrats, if you are equipped with the most persuasive machine that anyone's ever built, which is also generating huge amounts of wealth and allows you to achieve extremely efficient and effective influence and communications activities across the economy as well, then it's not necessarily clear that you wouldn't also gain a huge amount of power and, in a sense, be able to do a reverse takeover of the US government if you want to sort of take that forward. Who knows who gets to decide at the end of the day? But we would argue that, first of all, you really want to avoid getting to that position because there are genuinely no good answers when you get to that place. And secondly, if you do find yourself heading in that direction of huge wealth inequality, it is much better to start the conversation now about what those mechanisms could look like, despite the fact they're completely politically untenable with current administrations and all the rest of it, rather than just expect us to come up with all of this further down the track. And that is the work actually we are doing at the Windfall Trust.
Back to the meta outcome. The meta outcome was, well, we're not quite sure what the answers are today, but we're going to think much harder about it. Is there any evidence that the politicians and their advisors involved are actually dedicating time to this, that they're carving out some resources compared to all the other pressures that politicians face on a day-to-day basis?
I'll answer in relation to the UK specifically. To give the UK government credit on this, they had already, I think, a few months ago, established a sort of AI and the future of work unit, which was specifically thinking about these issues. And then the Chancellor announced a couple of weeks ago a new institute, which I think will be housed in the Treasury, which is focused on AI's impacts on the economy, upside and downside, I think. So it's both sides of the coin. So the UK government are doing something, to give them the credit. The UK has already led the world on AI safety when they initiated the Safety Summit series with the Ditchley Park Summit a few years ago. That agenda has evolved over time, but I think we can be rightly proud in the UK that we kicked that off and people do recognise the UK as being a leader on that front. There's no reason whatsoever why the UK cannot now play that role with the economic impacts of AI. And this institute that's been announced is a good starting point, although, of course, we can wait and see exactly how it gets staffed and what its mandate actually looks like. But I think it would be very good positioning for the UK to say we're one of the nations that is taking the economic impacts of AI seriously. We're not just putting on rose-tinted sunglasses and saying everything's going to be fine. We are seriously considering the downside risks. We're thinking about the scenarios and we're broadening the policy debate to include a wide range of levers that might be necessary, sort of in an emergency break glass sort of attitude. I think the UK could do that work very well over a 6 to 9 month period in an independent commission or something within the government itself. And that would be genuinely valuable for many other nations to take a look at who respect the UK, particularly on economic policy matters. So it seems to me that there's an open opportunity here for the UK to push this forward, not only for its own self-interest, but also in the interests of many other people around the world.
I think that would be an excellent initiative. Do you have any indication that this institute is going to take seriously the more radical scenarios? And the reason I ask that is that the only journalist I know who takes these ideas at all seriously is Robert Peston, who's been talking about it for a while. And again, on a podcast this week, he was saying he cannot find anybody at any level of government, and he knows people from top to bottom of the government. Nobody is willing to take this seriously. He had a chat with one of the co-founders of Monzo. It isn't being discussed at all.
I think I give the UK government slightly more credit than Robert is suggesting there. I think it is being discussed, not least in some of the work that we are doing behind closed doors that I can't really discuss because it's behind closed doors. But I know that people in the rooms that we're involved with and the conversations that are happening that we're at least involved with. And I can say from that perspective, some of these scenarios are indeed being taken seriously. I think what is difficult is that currently there's no politician really making this agenda an important part of their platform. So a lot of the work is beneath the surface in a sense. I would also say, as I mentioned earlier, that it's way behind the track in terms of where you'd hope we'd got to by now. So it feels like we're just starting out when in fact we should have been thinking about this for quite a few years already. But nevertheless, I think directionally things are looking a little bit more positive than Robert Peston is arguing there. But the order of magnitude, I would agree with him. If you can find someone who's talking about this, you would rather hope that there was many more people doing that and at more senior levels, particularly on the political side.
Yeah. When I wrote The Economic Singularity back in 2016, I wrote the first edition of it, I thought that the arrival of self-driving cars would be what would wake people up. I thought people would see them maybe on the telly, and when they go on holiday to San Francisco, they'd see these cars being driven around by AIs, and they'd think, well, we don't let humans drive those things until they're adults, and now there are robots doing it. okay, that means that all this science fiction-like stuff that people are talking about is real. They're coming for my job. I thought it would wake everybody up. Turns out it hasn't at all. People now know that there are self-driving cars in San Francisco and a dozen other American cities and all over the place in China. They're coming to London shortly. And we just get used to it. Okay, that's how life is. Then I got a bit despairing. I thought, well, nothing is going to wake people up. And so we're going to arrive at the economic singularity totally unprepared, and it will be a disaster. But then two things dawned on me. One was the experience of COVID, which was very interesting. In a very short period of time, we went from business as usual to, oh, whoops, we have to shut half of the economy down. And that means we have to give money to getting on for half the population. It was dealt with in different ways by different governments around the world, but almost universally and very, very fast. Governments instituted what was effectively universal basic income. And that proved two things. Firstly, it's necessary and it works. And secondly, it's not affordable in the current type of economy because it bankrupts economies. So COVID demonstrated that sometimes humanity is good in a crisis and can turn on a dime. So that gave me some hope. And the other thing I thought was, actually, it's really not the politicians' fault that none of them are talking about this publicly. I remember Hillary Clinton saying back in 2016 that the future of jobs was extremely scary, and her advisors had all told her, do not talk about that in public at all, because everybody will assume you're crazy. If the population at large is not taking the idea of the economic singularity seriously, then politicians can't, because they'll get elected out at the next time round. So we all have to wake up, and then our politicians can take it seriously. So it's a top-down and a bottom-up thing that has to go on at the same time.
Yes, although I would suggest that you're being very generous to politicians there, because I think, as we said earlier, if you ask ordinary people what are they concerned about with AI, then jobs is usually the number one thing. So people are not stupid. They can join the dots in the way that you are describing, and they are genuinely anxious about what this means for the future of, if not their job, then certainly their children's jobs. So I think it is filtering through into the public consciousness. But I agree with you that politicians are very, very unwilling to discuss it, partially because people don't want to talk about things that are scary and difficult, but also because people don't want to talk about things which they don't have an answer for. Why would you raise a problem which you don't have a solution for? Which again brings me back to this idea of we need much more work on this, because if the reason we're not discussing it is because we don't have any answers, then the obvious thing to do is to start developing better answers.
Yeah.
Or at least mapping out the terrain.
And so one of the things we need, I think, is some positive scenarios for how this actually could all work out well. Because if everybody thinks, well, either this isn't going to happen or it's going to be a total disaster and everybody dies, then we won't think about it because it's too scary. It's a bit like death. We all think we think about death, but actually most people don't think about death at all. And we would do the same with the economic singularity. I may be being overgenerous to politicians. I think you're being overgenerous to the public. The public is worried about the future of jobs. But what I hear all the time when I give talks on the future of AI is how does my son, nephew, niece educate themselves and start a career which will be future-proof? Most people seem to believe there will always be jobs. It's just there might not be jobs for some people. What we have to grapple with as a population, as a species, is the idea that there won't actually be jobs for almost everybody, but that could be a really good world if we figure out a plan to deal with it, which I firmly believe. I think that an abundance economy in which AIs are producing colossal amounts of wealth, as long as we figure out the distribution problem, which is a massive problem, but if we figure that out, we could have a terrific future.
I do agree with that. And I should plug, actually, we published last week on our website at windfalltrust.org something we're calling the Policy Atlas, which has 48 policies across the range, the spectrum of policies I mentioned earlier, tax, etc., mapped out, not to say that do all of these things and everything will be fine, but to try to offer that much broader range and more structured way of thinking about the options for the future, rather than just always defaulting to a few simple ideas which probably aren't going to work. The other thing I'd say in response to your broader point is this is also about speed of transition. If the speed of transition becomes very accelerated, it becomes much more like COVID. And then we do have a situation where it's sort of an emergency and maybe we can rely on the governments to step in. What you might call the sort of central case, though, could be something which plays out a little bit more slowly, sort of the slow speed car crash, where we start to see certain parts of the economy being impacted first, certain jobs being disrupted first. Then I think as society, we have a choice about whether we lean into that and say, okay, let's take this as an early warning indicator. What shall we do? Or whether we dismiss it and keep saying, no, everything's going to be fine. It seems to me that that's the point at which we will really see whether this argument's going to fall one way or the other. I think younger people, entry-level work, graduate jobs could be, and has been referred to by Eric Brynjolfsson and others, as the canary in the coal mine. So that could be the discussion which it starts to become very hard to avoid actual disruption, which is really going to be impacting people's entire lives if they're missing out on this first step now. It might become harder and harder to explain that away other than by incorporating AI as part of that story. And when that happens, then I think we're forced to face up to it.
My final question, Adrian, is on the advice that you would give to governments and their advisors. Clearly, part of the advice is think hard about this, but do you have something more specific that you wish they would do?
This has to be taken more seriously across the whole of government. This isn't just a technology question or a business question or a growth question. This has to be a whole of government effort where we do need to consider broadly the range of possible scenarios that are going to happen, what that would mean across the whole of government, fiscal position, education, health, public services, etc. This needs to be taken as seriously as a potential pandemic, discussed at that whole of government level. And then the types of policy that we have in our policy atlas need to start to be engaged with at a more serious level. So we do need a serious conversation about taxation, for example. Why do we tax capital at a lower level than labor today? That just doesn't seem like it makes sense. And it certainly doesn't seem like it's going to be sustainable. We need to have a conversation on all of these different aspects of policy. Again, that means the whole of government needs to be involved. And then this is a political point rather than a policy point. I do think we need to see politicians starting to engage with this, as we were discussing earlier, because it's very difficult for government to really push something forward if it doesn't have political cover. And at the moment, we don't have senior politicians in the UK anyway who are willing to say, this is an issue that I'm taking seriously, I'm worried about, and I'm making sure that I'm leading my bit of the government to help try to prepare for this.
That point about why do we tax capital so much less than tax labour always puzzles me, because I think the answer is pretty obvious. Capital is mobile and labour fundamentally isn't. If you're a billionaire, you can hop from Dubai to Milan if things get a bit hot in Dubai, but most people can't. They're rooted. They don't have the financial means to just up sticks and go, whereas capital can go instantaneously, more or less. If one jurisdiction becomes less friendly to capital, off it goes. And you can try and stop that, but generally it doesn't work. The final question I'd like to ask is, I know you're in the business of scenarios, not predictions, so I'll understand if you don't want to offer a view, but if we're going to go to full automation, do you think it will be slow or quick? And let me frame that slightly. It seems to me the reason why AIs are not being widely deployed, AI agents particularly, are not being widely deployed, and why AI isn't being deployed at enterprise scale very much at the moment, is it doesn't work because it hasn't got common sense. And it makes stupid mistakes, which humans mostly don't. And the classic example recently was the car wash, where an AI was asked, the car wash is 50 meters away, should I drive or walk? And it said, well, it's only 50 meters, obviously you should walk. But in fact, any human would say, well, if you're going to do a car wash, you're probably going to wash your car, you're going to need your car. So that sort of lack of common sense is what's stopping AI being deployed. Now, once that is solved, and it will be, then instantaneously, AI will be better, cheaper, and faster at pretty much every cognitive job and an awful lot of manual jobs as well, which seems to me to promote the conclusion that the transition will be very quick, that there will be full employment up until the common sense gap is bridged, and then there'll be zero employment, or more or less. Is that your view, or do you take a different view, or do you need to stick with the scenarios?
I'm happy to offer my view on this. I sort of half agree with you, I think. When I think about the economic impacts of AI, I think of it as a function of capabilities, which is what you were describing there, and diffusion, which is what economists worry about. The capabilities trajectories, I think still most people haven't grasped, and you've referenced this already, that whatever people think AI can't do is possibly because they tried something 6 months ago or 12 months ago and it didn't really work, and then they put it to one side and say, well, that wasn't actually very good. And almost certainly it can do that now. So whatever it is you think it can't do, just double check to make sure that the latest models can't do it. Even the car wash example. But we also know that these capabilities curves are still exponentially improving. The task time, which is the very famous graph that is produced by Meta, Meta, who are the leading authority on measuring AI capabilities, that task time graph is doubling now every 4 months. And that's for a coding task, but they believe that the same logic is applicable to other tasks as well. The diffusion question, though, of course, is where a lot of the debate happens. Even economists have kind of come on board with that capabilities argument now. But on the diffusion side, some people are extremely bullish about diffusion, which is where you are, which is once we've crossed those thresholds, there's no economic reason why you wouldn't see this disruption just wash through the economy. And then there are others that much more strongly emphasize all of the bottlenecks in the economy, which include very real structural ones, laws, etc., that just would have to be rewritten if we were going to change how things would happen, as well as professional interests and other people kind of stymieing efforts for technology to be deployed. So for me, I agree with you on the capability side of things. I'm a bit more willing to accept that certain parts of the economy will be bottlenecked. And so I think we will see your scenario play out in certain domains, let's say coding in the frontier labs, for example. And we will see other domains where the diffusion is much slower due to the bottlenecks. And in a sense, we should be happy that those bottlenecks exist because that buys us the time to then actually think how we are going to navigate this period and change course if necessary. So in that sense, the bottlenecks are good. That's why I half agree with you. Yes, on the capabilities and yes, in certain parts of the economy, but large parts of the economy, I think, will still be stuck in the diffusion part of this equation for some time.
The bottlenecks topic is a good one to pick up. My own view is that there will be many companies stumbling due to bottlenecks and they'll go out of business. They'll be overtaken by much nimbler, smaller companies or by companies who take the advice of brand new AI-savvy groups. Now, it may be that there are national bottlenecks with laws, but then the countries that are bottlenecked in these ways, they'll be overtaken by, I don't know, the South Koreans or people from Dubai or wherever. Countries are upgrading their legal systems more quickly. And suddenly countries that were previously proud members of the G20 will fall back. So I'm not so confident as you that the bottlenecks will delay the adoption of this transformative AI too long. But maybe we should discuss it more as a follow-up because perhaps we should be collectively engineering bottlenecks and getting them agreed on the global scale.
Potentially so. And I do think that what we also haven't discussed is if we look down these horizons and see futures which we just don't think we can navigate, is it also possible to bend the technological curve? So that would be where you say, rather than developing these general purpose AIs that are generally intelligent, we could get almost all the benefits if we have narrower AIs that are very good at medical research, for example, or very good at engineering and don't need to wholesale replace human beings. And I think ultimately it might be that the power of these scenarios, including the economic singularity, is that if you look over the edge of the cliff and you realize that it's going to be very, very difficult to get to that abundant future that you describe where everybody's happy, that we say, why are we doing this to ourselves? Why are we putting ourselves in a position where we have to try and come up with remedies to a problem that we're creating for ourselves? And the riposte to that is usually, but there's a race dynamic. We can't slow the technology. We can't change it. But it could be the case that we look over the edge and say, well, maybe we still need to do that.
Well, I think there's little doubt that if we were a truly rational species, we would pause because the perils of not pausing are enormous, not just the economic singularity, but the technological singularity and the likelihood that we're developing our successor species and we might not survive that experience. But we've demonstrated over and over again we can't pause technology. And people often say, well, if America paused and China wouldn't. That's not true. China doesn't like uncontrolled minds. They would pause willingly, but Russia wouldn't, North Korea wouldn't. I don't think Elon Musk would, and I don't think the mafia would. So sadly, we're not a rational species, which is probably why we are the apex predator, and we're not going to pause, I think, sadly. Sorry to end on that slightly gloomy note, but Adrian, I'm absolutely delighted that you set the Windfall Trust up and that you're doing what you're doing. I think it's really, really important. You're obviously starting to make some headway, which is absolutely terrific. So congratulations.
Thanks very much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I do think we can find a path forward. I do think it's possible. I am optimistic, but it does require us to do the work. That's what we're arguing for. And your podcast is part of that.
Well, my pause remains about 2/3. I think that as we come closer to the edge, it'll be a little bit like the COVID experience. People around the world, including the Vladimir Putins and the Korean dictators, they will realize it's in their own interest not to go down that route. We can pick that up another time. My thanks to you, Adrian, for being a guest on the Futurists podcast.